I recently joined a new gym and I had this early morning consultation with one of the personal trainers there, and we introduce ourselves to each other. After a little bit, things start to get awkward. I notice this person's discomfort through the way that they're kind of shifting in their chair and the waver in the tone of their voice. And I realized that my internal state, I was feeling a little crabby, a little irritable that early morning, was likely sending messages to this personal trainer and making them feel uncomfortable. So I became mindful of my communication. I sat more upright in my chair, and we're wearing these masks, and so I start really putting a lot more effort into my facial expressions, raising my eyebrows, having my cheeks move the mask up and down. I think if there's one thing that the pandemic, the age of COVID, has taught us about nonverbal communication is that facial expressions are pretty important. They carry a lot of information. They do a lot of relational work when we're communicating with other people. And so when we've been wearing these masks, we've had to kind of over compensate for that. I want to talk in this lecture about nonverbal communication, obviously. I'm going to be talking about the functions, a little bit of nonverbal communication and the types of nonverbal communication. And to help me do that, I'm just going to continue talking about this little interaction I had at my new gym as I'm meeting to consult with this personal trainer. So we'll try to talk through these things with this example. I'm being asked in that situation to do a lot of work, right? Or I'm asking myself to do a lot of communicative work that morning. I'm not quite ready for my workout, and I'm definitely not ready for all the work that's involved in meeting a new person and going through a professional consultation with them. I'm trying to do a lot of things with my nonverbal communication, and so is this other person. Both of us are trying to be understood, right? We want to effectively communicate our ideas. We want our nonverbal message to assist in the interpretation of our verbal message. So we're doing work to be understood. We're doing some work to be liked by the other person. We want to present ourselves in an attractive, likable way. Each of us is trying to do that work. We're trying to be respected by each other, to both be seen as people of status or people worth respecting, people of equal rank, perhaps. We're both trying to accomplish a performance, a conversation, an everyday ritual. This conversation is going to happen. We've scheduled it, and we're both trying to use our nonverbal communication to get through that conversation, to open it, to carry it on, and then to eventually close that conversation. And we're also using our nonverbal communication to accomplish certain personal and social goals. Personally, right, I'm trying to improve my health, get a better workout, get some information from somebody who's supposed to be an expert, and they're trying to do their job. They're playing their social role, and they're going to use their nonverbal communication to help them to do that. So there's a lot of work that's being done, and the nonverbal communication that we're having is functioning in a lot of different ways as we're talking to one another, even though we're wearing these masks. One main function of nonverbal communication is the expression of emotions. We can talk about our emotions, but our brains are hardwired to display our emotions in our bodies. And that is happening at a pretty unconscious level. We don't think very much about our nonverbal messages, not quite the same way as we construct a verbal message in our conscious mind. It's connected to the cognitive unconscious. Now, we can consciously express emotions, right? So I'm feeling that morning with the personal trainer, crabby and irritable, but I don't want to express that emotion to this person, so I'm masking it, and I'm trying to consciously send a message that I like this person. I'm smiling or trying to smile, right? And despite that, though, my body is likely betraying certain emotions that I'm just not able to control. So expressing emotions is one of the functions, and as we're having this consultation, we're each taking a read of each other's emotional condition. We're also expressing, as we're talking to each other, relational information about how attracted to each other we are, how much we like each other, how we see each other's status. And so we're going to use our nonverbal communication to express relational information. If I'm displeased with this gym and this person's work as an employee, I might show that through my nonverbal communication, my disposition, how I'm sitting, my use of eye contact. If I didn't respect them as an expert, I might show that. And the reverse of that, if I do respect them as an expert, I would show that in certain ways. I'm using my nonverbal communication, as I said, to be understood, to try to convey a certain meaning to my partner, my conversational partner. I'm going to do that by either reinforcing the message with my nonverbal communication. In that way, I would be using my nonverbal communication to try to match or support the verbal message. But I can also use my nonverbal communication in a way that contradicts the verbal message. And that would send what we call a mixed message and be perhaps confusing to the person. So they might say, how are you liking the gym? And I say something like, oh, I really like it. Right? And if I say it like that, the verbal message is going to be contradicted by my nonverbal tone and expression. So we could contradict. We can also use nonverbal messages to substitute for verbal messages and convey an almost symbolic meaning through the use of what's called an emblem. An emblem would be like okay, thumbs up, just pointing at something when someone asks you, where is it? So substituting is and an emblem is when the nonverbal communication stands in for a particular verbal message. We can use our nonverbal communication to influence each other. We're going to be reading each other's behavior and nonverbal messages, and that's going to affect how we're going to treat one another. I want to use my nonverbal communication to get certain things from other people, and so I'm going to try to convey a certain demeanor towards them and set of feelings towards them in order to accomplish my social goals. And I could be using my communication to deceive this person. The textbook has an interesting discussion of deception, and you should check that out in this chapter. If I'm lying, of course, I'm going to lie not just with my verbal message, I'm also going to lie with my nonverbal message. There's examples of outright kind of unethical lying, and then there's other shades of what we might call politeness, where it's a kind of deception, but it is a accommodation to other people socially, right? Everybody wants to be liked. Everybody wants to be left to make their own choices. And so I'm going to adapt my communication. I'm not going to necessarily say everything that I'm thinking. So I'm going to try to, like in this example of the personal trainer, I'm going to try to get them to like me because I want them to give me good advice. And so I'm going to try to convey a certain attitude towards them, even if that's not exactly what I'm feeling. So that's the polite and social thing to do. And it's not exactly lying, right? In fact, we could make an argument that that's probably more ethical than just letting it out your subconscious all the time on your outward display. So we're going to use our nonverbal communication to influence other people. We're going to use the nonverbal communication here to try to regulate the conversation. We're going to use our eye contact with each other to indicate when we're done talking and when the other person can talk. We're going to change the tone of our voices to do that. And that's going to be done throughout the conversation. And we're going to use our nonverbal communication to try to express our identities. This was a person who appeared to me to be a woman. They were expressing their gender identity in a certain way non-verbally. And I was presenting my gender identity non-verbally as well. She was wearing a employee's outfit, right? A uniform for the gym. She had a name badge. So she's expressing her identity non-verbally as an employee. And I'm wearing gym clothes. So I'm expressing my identity as a gym goer. Also, there's a class identity that I'm expressing non-verbally. I'm the kind of person who can afford clothes that are just for working out. I'm wearing Nike gym shoes. So our identities are being expressed as well. We're using, as we're having this consultation, a lot of different types of nonverbal communication. These are also sometimes called channels of nonverbal communication or codes of nonverbal communication. I've even seen them called signs of nonverbal communication. But these are different messages that we can send using different mechanisms to do so. And I'd like to talk over this list. Please read the textbook as it's going to dig much deeper into all of these. You know, I want you to be able to develop, after reading this chapter and listening to this lecture, a pretty good vocabulary for talking about and describing nonverbal communication. The better we're at describing it, the better we are at observing it, the better we are at doing it. So here are the types of nonverbal messages that we're interested in our readings. The first that we're going to talk about is called kinesics, which is the study of movement and how movement creates meaning. This includes gesture. It includes head movement and the posture of our body and how those things change. And it includes eye contact. And lastly, it includes facial expression. When it comes to gesture, as the personal trainer and I are talking to one another, we're likely using 3 different kinds of gestures. I'm a little tired, so I might be rubbing my eyes during this meeting, and that is what's called an adapter. An adapter is where you're trying to adapt to some sort of emotional or physical feeling that you're having. So pulling on your clothes, nervous tics, things like that are adapters. Another kind of gesture that we're likely using, I like to talk with my hands. So as we're talking and I'm talking, I'm using an illustrator to illustrate what I'm saying. An illustrator accompanies the verbal message and goes along with it to try to give a visual image of that message. So if I say, back in the day, that's an illustrator. If I say, I caught a fish and I kind of gesture like this, I'm using the gesture to illustrate the verbal message, I caught a fish. And the final kind of gesture that I'd like you to know about, I already mentioned, is called an emblem. It stands in for a word. So this could mean peace, this could mean two. If I just did this and said no words, I would be using a gesture called an emblem. Head movement and posture during the meeting, we're both trying to, or at least once I become mindful, we're both trying to show that we're engaged with each other in conversation. So I'm nodding along as the personal trainer's talking, and I am trying to stay in an upright position, leaning forward to show my engagement with this person. So head movement and the posture of our body communicates to the other person. Eye contact, whether we're looking at other people or not, if we're looking at other things in the room. Eye movement, and eye behavior, like smiling with your eyes, or squinting with your eyes, are all kind of meaningful ways of using eye communication. We use our facial expressions to express a lot of our emotions. Some of our emotions, as you'll read about in the textbook, are universally expressed on our face: happiness, fear, disgust, anger, and sadness are generally recognizable across cultures, but each culture has different expectations about when you would use those expressions. So there are many aspects of facial expression that are actually cultural as well. Again, we had our masks going, so it was really affecting our use of facial expressions during that meeting. And so I had to kind of overcompensate with using my forehead, which is actually quite expressive, as you may have noticed in some of these videos. Below kinesics is haptics, which is touch and touch communication. Touch is very significant. It has a lot of meaning in human communication, how we touch each other. Check out the different types of touch in the textbook. Functional professional, social polite touch, friendship or warmth touch, love and intimacy touch, and sexual or arousal touch. So these are kind of like different levels of meaning with touch that generally are used in different kinds of relationships. This was a professional relationship between strangers, so we stayed at the functional professional level of touch, which would be like a doctor touching you. So if this personal trainer wanted to show me good posture for squats or something, and they touched me, that would be a functional or professional touch. That wouldn't be considered intimate touch, right? There's also social polite touch. So when we first went into the room, we shook hands, and we did a social touch that was acceptable. Throughout the rest of the time we were together, there was no touching, right? And that is with the expectation of a professional setting between two strangers. So it would be weird if we were touching more like friends touch or lovers touch, and it could even be spell a lot of trouble, right? We can get into this kind of traumatic, violent type of communication if we were violating each other's touch expectations. So touch is very meaningful and important. Below haptics is paralanguage or paralinguistics, which are vocalics. And those are the aspects of the voice that are non-symbolic or non-verbal aspects of the voice. So if this person, asked me a question about whether I like the gym, and I said, yeah, it's great. It's the paralinguistics that would undercut the verbal message there. And my tone of voice would indicate a different meaning than the verbal message. So things like how urgent I want to be taken, how important it is. Like if I were to increase my volume, the volume increase expresses the urgency. So that's what we mean by paralinguistics. And during this meeting, I'm trying to use my paralinguistics to show that I am enthusiastic about this experience. And all right, moving on, spatial messages. We have different meanings and understanding of space. Those are also called proxemics. And this would refer to kind of like how far away we were from one another, our personal space. And in the United States, we generally recognize 4 different meaningful zones of personal space: a public space, a social space, a personal space, and an intimate space. Public space would be the biggest distance where if you were, like, say, at a bus stop and you're a good 12 feet away from somebody, you might not even acknowledge them in that situation. So public space, you're not necessarily expected to interact with other people, and you try to spread out, typically. Social space is where now you're able to have a conversation, and this is where this meeting with the personal trainer took place. Was at a social space. There was actually a table between us, and we were about 4 feet distance from each other. Touch is very unlikely in social space, but conversation is going to be sometimes expected if you're that close to one another. Personal space is from like 4 feet away to about 1 feet away. You're getting pretty close. It's a more friendly space. I would expect to know this person. So when we first met, we went into each other's personal space, but then we kind of retreated to a social space at this meeting with the personal trainer. Intimate space is from like 1 foot all the way to touching. And again, we only did that very briefly, and it would have had significant meaning had we violated the expectations for professional social use of space there. Territory deals with the kind of meaning of the space that we're in relationship to our own ownership. We have a tendency as human beings to kind of stake out our territory. We have primary territories that we own, that are our own, that we have a claim to. We have secondary territories that are territories that we share, but that we think of as our own. So if you go to the same spot in the library, you might come to think of that spot as your space, even though you don't own it at all. And then public spaces are those spaces that we share with other people. So this is not a public space. I am in the primary territory of the person that I'm talking to. This is an employee, and we're back in one of the back rooms, a staff-only room. And so it's a significant contributor to the meaning of the communication that I'm in this other person's territory for this meeting. Environment similarly refers to the communication and information that we take from the environment. When they're our own personal territories, we often decorate those environments in ways that we want to speak to our own identities. In this environment, there's a lot of workout equipment, and so it adds to the nonverbal territory of the personal trainer. Temporal and chronemics is another type of nonverbal message that we're utilizing in this interaction. Chronemics deals with our sense of time in our communication. Is our own personal sense of time. So, it's early in the morning for me at this meeting, and there's our own physical time. I had just woken up, and so my body's feeling tired. I have a certain biological rhythm that I'm using. I'm starting to get a little tired here. I should have made this video shorter. I apologize. There's also cultural use of time going on in this example. The United States is a monochronemic or monochronic culture. And that's where we view time as a more rigid, kind of pre-planned, laid out, minute to minute, one use of time, versus cultures that have polychronemic times. They'll have times where there's a literal interpretation of by the clock, and there are other times where there's more a loose use of time and an understanding of when things are going to start. So in the United States, this meeting was at 7:30 in the morning. We expect you to get there at 7:30 in the morning and to stick to a schedule. This was supposed to be a half-hour meeting, so I'm expecting for us to use that time in that half hour. If this was a polychronic culture, we might keep our appointments in a very rigid way, but if it was, say, meeting up with a friend or having dinner at somebody's house, the start time is going to be interpreted in a much more loose fashion. You can show up, come and go as you please. There is not as rigid a view of a time in a polychronic culture. Also going on in this conversation, there's our different senses of how the time should be used conversationally. There's our sense of the beginning of the conversation. We're going to start with some small talk. We're going to introduce ourselves. Then there's the sense of the middle of the conversation where we're going to get more task-oriented and start, asking and answering these questions that are part of the consultation. And then there's going to be the kind of end of conversation behaviors that we're going to be expecting as we wrap it up, kind of say how we felt about how it went and part from one another. And so there's that sense of time that's going on in our communication as well. There's our personal presentation, how we appear. I already talked a little bit about our dress. And so that is a part of our nonverbal communication as well. So there's a lot going on when we're nonverbally communicating with one another. There are lots of different functions and lots of different types and channels of nonverbal communication that we're sending to one another. So we sometimes are not mindful of it. We're just automatically going through our days, and we're displaying our nonverbal communication and sending out all these different kinds of messages to the people that we're communicating with. It takes some work, like it did for me in that situation, to become mindful of our nonverbal communication and to try to convey the messages that we want to convey. Thank you very much.